You want to go, pussy? Come on, hurry up. Well, hurry, here you are. Come on, hurry up, quick. Here it is. I thought you said you wanted to grow. Well, there, taking your time about it.
She was a year or so old when the family moved from Saskatoon to the Kindersley area, and though she's just a baby, she was there when the house was being built, and so she's been part of that structure from day one.
When we had the heritage came for the provincial, one man said that if it was a sod house with an upstairs, so I just told him to follow me. That was my brother's room in there, and you can see all that grey. That's the cat now is taking over that, so she goes up and has a sleep. You can see the garden, how big it is, and you see that long screw over there goes way, way over. You see the length of it? That's where they got the sod from. Brought it over on a stone boat pulled by oxen. They started in England in 1907. Dad came over first by himself, but that was in the spring, and then a little bit later in the year, my mother brought their two older children with her and came over on the boat. Dad was a carpenter. He started when he was 11 years old, and he was a very meticulous carpenter, but he was also interested in these trains that would come through and show how they could get this land. Land over there was very expensive, and Dad always wanted to be independent. So he was very interested in seeing what they would show on the trains. And of course, when they would show on those trains would be all the good things. One word they were never to use when they're advertising was the word cold. They were never to tell the people how cold it got over here. So they decided to come to Canada, and they could get the quarter section of land for $10. He came to Winnipeg first, and in Winnipeg they advised him to go on to Saskatoon, because Saskatoon was just really busy then, just building up. It was just a village, but they were anxiously working there. So Dad went on to Saskatoon. He got work on the city hospital, and he got work on the brewery. In 1908, he had a chance to come out with some other settlers just for a trip out to find where his quarter was. On the way out, he looked at all the sod shacks, and he passed a lot of them. They're mostly just one-room sod shacks. And he noticed they were falling in or falling out. So he decided they were just constructed wrong.
They were walking from Saskatoon to Kindersley, which is a fair hike. He'd look at all these sod houses. I guess he had an idea that he was going to be building a sod house. He'd stop and look at what the other pioneers were building, and he'd talk to them about what worked and what didn't work. And by the time he got there, he decided on a format for building his house that was very different from what the other settlers were doing.
Dad decided that he would build the walls 4 feet thick at the bottom and tape them 7 feet high, and then taper them up to 3. And every time he put a layer of sod on, he would turn it around so that when you're putting bricks on, you don't have the cracks coming together. And then he took a hoe and hollowed out the top of every layer.
And then being laid on an angle, all the center of gravity worked towards the center of the wall instead of off to one side or another. The walls slope both inside and outside the house, although the interior slope is not as dramatic as the outside. It's sort of sloped, about a 5 degree, I would say, on the inside, and about a 10 degree on the outside. And that was the key to keeping that building structurally sound.
He found a slough that was quite shallow, and he decided that would be the best place to get the sod, because the roots, the grass was tall and the roots were well holding the sod together. He brought a walking plow with him and he cut the sod about 3 inches thick. And then he brought it over on the stone boat to where he wanted to use it. Then by 1910, the railway was coming through to Kindersley. It hadn't been before, so then the family all came out. He'd got his got some equipment then, a cow and calf and some oxen. They got a settler's car, and they could put everything in that. And my uncle was also come out by that time. He had asked to have his name put down for a quarter. But there was no roof on this house yet, or at least it wasn't finished anyway. And so they stayed in bachelor shacks until it get into November. And Dad decided, well, they had to do something to get into the house, so he built the back porch, thinking he would take it away later. There was still no floor on it, but Dad worked on the floor. They were just sod just on the earth first, and then during the winter he got the floor in. And they put a cowhide first over the door, and he got the door on. And then he wanted to get the chimney done, so he had to work on that. As well as that, they had to make a sod barn, and they had to put up feed for their animals. And so it wasn't until 1911, really, before they got the chimney on and were able to use all the rest of the house.
When they first built the building, her father, James Addison, and her uncle, they decided that they were going to put a large roof on it with the intent that eventually they'd remove the sods. So there's a pole structure inside the building that actually holds the frame that holds the roof. The roof is so large that they have 3 rooms up there and original skylights. The east and west ends of the roof have a skylight in it that were built right at the outset when skylights were not really a popular item, but it was the only way to get light into those small rooms at the ends.
Dad believed they should always have dormers on the roof. He thought any house that was built with just a flat roof or anything was just a box, he said, with a roof on. He determined to make it a dormer. If it didn't have dormers on it, it wasn't a proper roof.
James was really, alert to the fact that if you have sod, it's going to wear down. You're going to get rain on it. You're going to get all insect attacks and everything else. So he's always had it covered with some kind of siding. There was initially, I believe it was some kind of a vine that's on the building.
Mother used to try to put vines up and to make it look nicer. So I used to do that too, but that was a lot of work because you put strings up to try to get the vines to climb up, and they only lasted part of the season anyway, and they would be gone. He put the plaster over the walls, as you can see in the back there, and then he plastered all the walls in here in the house. He got that done, and he was going to put heavier plaster on the walls on the outside of the house, but never got that done. So of course the wind and the rain gradually eroded, and he still never got it done because he had to work up a quarter of that land, you see, in order to prove it up. So it took a while to get that done. He had only put 2-foot sod walls around the lean-to at the back, so they began to crumble worse than the other. And then even around the other part of the house they were crumbling, so finally he put boards around.
And then after that, there was shingles. And then by the time I saw it in the 80s, it was asphalt rolled roofing, a gray rolled roofing, like asphalt shingle type material. And now I believe it's like a vinyl siding. But it needs some form of protective covering, both inside and out, to preserve the sods. In any pioneer situation, you build with the resources that are there. So if you've got an extremely rocky terrain, well, the easiest thing to build with is stone. If you're in the bushland, you build with lumber. Well, when you're on the bald prairie, you don't have any rocks and you don't have any wood. The only other thing available to you is the soil itself. So in some cases, they would dig down into the soil and just build a large shelter and then find some poles to put over it. And you get like a root cellar type arrangement, and that's their temporary dwelling. A sod house was deliberately temporary until they could build a good frame structure or a masonry structure, after several years of living in the sod house. And once that was accomplished, they would quickly abandon it. If you grew up in a sod house, it was almost like a point of shame. It's not something that most people were proud of.
We just took it as it was. I think this was home. Dad was going to remove all that sod that he'd put there and just make it into a wooden house. And he's going to use the same roof, but he wanted to, so that's why he wanted to make such a good roof. He said he was going to use that same roof. Dad was quite a dreamer, really, and he would talk about when he was going to get that new house, always when I build a new house. And then as years went on and people were admiring what he'd done, I think he felt that he wouldn't want to destroy this house anymore, so he had other ideas. He was going to build a house across the road. He had that land then too. And he was going to build it so that it had veranda, a glassed-in veranda on 3 sides. I remember my mother saying, "But look at all the window cleaning." But then that was women's work, so it didn't bother Dad.
After we got past the 1955 Jubilee, I think people look back more nostalgically at those pioneers. They said, yeah, I grew up in a sod house. Edith became a teacher and left the site as soon as she got her teaching qualifications. And she taught in the region and in the province. She became quite self-sufficient in the process of her teaching career. And they're living, and they had the farm as a resource. There's a lot of oil underneath that. It's in the oil country, so they're getting some revenues from the oil revenues. And so she was able to travel a lot. She became an avid photographer.
The shape of the snow after the blizzard looked so much like all these gods or whatever you call it around the temples in Egypt. And it looked so much like that, and there was a sundog up there, so I called it God of the Sundog because it looked the same kind of a shape. I'd get out and take pictures of nature. That's why I liked Africa so much. There's so many wild animals to take pictures of there.
Her photographs were often entered into contests, and she'd win with some of her contests. So she was, I'm not sure if she considered herself a professional photographer, but she was a very accomplished photographer.
After I finished teaching, I spent time traveling. I traveled to every continent in the world.
She just didn't quit just because she retired. And 3 years ago, she went to Australia for Christmas.
I should like to keep on, but now we had too many birthdays, so I can't travel now.
The inventory of sod houses, certainly in Saskatchewan, is very small. It's less than a handful of structures. The few that we have seen are vacant, they're abandoned, they're in, often the roof is missing, there's, they're just derelict structures, and they won't be around much longer. There are a few replicas that have been built, like the one at Elbow. And then there are some sod brick houses. These are large blocks that are about 18 inches by 6 inches by about 9. And they're just like huge concrete blocks, but made out of mud. So to find one like this that's intact, has been well looked after, and is still being lived in by original family members almost 100 years later, most unusual.
Dad took this picture. Well, I'm standing in the front. I'd be about 3 or 4. My hair at that time, it used to be curly and quite fair. And then my sister's behind me, and there's my brother. This was taken in, 1912. That was when the house was still covered with vines. Mother tried to keep vines up growing around it to make it look a little better. Electricity came in after the NDP government came in, and Tommy Douglas was determined to get the electricity through the country. We didn't think it was possible. We read that in New Zealand they had out on the farms, but we thought we'd never do it here, so far apart. But it did come in the 1950s, and that was a wonderful thing. If you notice, the wires are put on the outside, and my sister said the reason was that the people that came around, they went around to the bachelor shack, because just a dad and my brother here, and therefore they knew all they wanted was electricity. They weren't anxious of their appearance. So they went to these people who were putting it in, went around to all the bachelors first and got to see the wires were not put in because they thought it wasn't necessary. After I was retired and I got that well dug. And so then I asked them then if they could, I said I wanted the water into the house. I went to see the propane man in Kindersley, and I said, which would be the best for a vent? Would you have a wall vent or a ceiling vent? Well, he says, your walls won't be more than 4 inches thick, will they? I said, they're 4 feet. Even the people at Kindersley didn't know this house was out here.
The energy efficiency is exceptional. With walls that are 4 feet wide at the base, 3 feet at the top, you have a very thick wall, and it takes a long time in the summertime for the heat to penetrate that sod. So it stays nice and cool there all summer long, and it takes a while for that heat that is in there, that is accumulated over summer, to leave it in the fall.
The propane dealer in Kindersley said that, you're sure not using much propane? I said, no, we're poor customers. Oh no, he says, you're not poor customers, but if I had many like you, I'd go broke. One lady came one time and she said to me, has this house always been lived in? I said, yes, it has. She said, well, it sure doesn't look like it, does it? So after I retired and my dad had passed away by that time, I decided we had to do something else to make the house look better. So we got roll siding. The windows, you see, were all that outside part. You could see the sod, and it didn't have the windowsills weren't fixed right. My brother was nearly blind, but I would do the measuring of the plywood and get all the lines, and then I'd start the sawing and watch as he sawed so that he could get it cut for me. And then I did after he did get it cut to the size, I did the hammering and get it nailed in, and then after that I got it painted. So we got all the windows were much better than they got. They're white as we have now, and so it brought the light in much better.
The window wells are very deep, and because they're at about the halfway mark, so there's about 3 foot wide window wells. And the doors are hung, because there's on that 5-degree slope, the doors are hung on a slope, so when you go to close the door, it really closes with a good bang. And when you first encounter that catches you off guard, because you're expecting doors to just swing and open and close on a perfect level plane, and these don't do that. An old abandoned sod house is not going to be rehabilitated. So the only good one we have is the Addison Sod House. And it's so good that, in fact, it merits national recognition by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada.
Eldon Johnson was the one that I guess was telling them about it, because nobody hadn't ever thought of it, I guess. And so anyway, they came and I said, well, yes, if there's any major repair, they will pay 50% of it in Regina. And then there was a man came from Ottawa, and then from Federal, and I guess it's about the only one left in the country, so last summer they made it into a federal heritage too.
Now that building has gone from, just a typical pioneer sod house to some extent to being a National Historic Site. not at all what anybody ever dreamed of, even into the 70s. It was still always an interesting sod house, but just a sod house. To be elevated to that status says something both for the construction technique and the fact that this is a rare feature in our national heritage. One of the nice things, of course, about the Addison place is that one of the original family members was actually alive to see it taken from a place that was just a local curiosity to being a site that was designated provincially and then nationally. Edith was at all three of those stages. She was there for the ceremony unveiling the provincial heritage property plaque. She was there when the National Historic Site plaque was unveiled. And so unlike some other sites that may be, like 100 or 200 years old before they're designated and recognized, here the person who was so intimately involved actually got to see and enjoy the honor and acclaim of seeing this home designated as heritage property. The provincial historic marker at the Addison Sod House is the only one that is regularly severely tarnished, and I expect it's acid rain that's pouring down on it. Northwest of the farmhouse is Colville, and there's an oil facility of some sort. I'm not sure if it's a refinery or what. All the other markers, they last for decades and they look quite nice, but the one at the Addison Sod House looks like it's just pitted and it's discolored, and I think it's been replaced once already. And I expect it's the acid rain doing it. Now, I don't know if that's going to have any effect in long term on the house, but it could have on the vegetation and the kind of wildlife that's out there. When you drive up to the site, they still have the original plow there that they used to cut the sods. When I first saw it, it was in a little bit worse shape. The wooden handles had deteriorated significantly, but it was sitting out in the back, they're dumped with other old equipment.
I love gardening, but I'm disappointed with my gardening this year. I planned on taking it and taking my rototiller and making rows, but it was either too wet. It was too wet at first, I couldn't do it. And then they got hot and dry, and it's too lumpy and dry. So I just decided I'll just put up with it this year, and maybe I can get to garden next year.
Just recently, we heard that Edith had had a stroke. I've known Edith now for just about 20 years, I would say. And she was still mentioning to me she would get up on the tractor and plow her garden every spring and looked after it. She's just right into her mid-90s. She's looked after that farmstead and done it all on her own. So with Edith now partially paralyzed, it's going to be difficult. But on the other hand, she's a tough old lady. And we were very much looking forward to her being present on the centennial of its construction. Edith planted lots of flowers in her garden as well as vegetables. Very beautiful to see in the summertime when all that was in bloom. But she was also very concerned when we talked about the designation that she wanted those trees protected. She says, because there's a lot of wildlife in the trees. And she says, we've always had wildlife here. There are deer and various birds and so forth. And she doesn't want those trees to go. She says, it's not just the house, it's the farmyard is what's important to her and to her family. And so we made sure that in the designation we included the whole shelter belt area. Any building, it can be protected through legislation, but that's only as good as the legislation is there. The designation affords recognition, and it may afford some financial assistance to help preserve a structure. But designation does not protect a site. You need to have a tenant. You need to have an owner who can look after a structure. And that's what the house needs, is a full-time resident, preferably a family member. It would be nice if this house could, over the next 100, 200 years, always have an Addison family member living there. It just adds something to the quality of a heritage site when it stays within the family.
My sister had multiple sclerosis, so I brought her daughter up. So she is the one that will inherit it. But whether she will actually live in here or build another little house to live in, I don't know. It just seems as if that sod out there is, now there's got the porch part, you know, and protected. It'll last forever.